Thanks for joining us in this special occasion here. Warm welcome to Terence, to Mark, and to Khaled here with us today. I started having informal discussions first with Mark last year, who very kindly introduced me to both Terence and Khaled. Terence joined us last year at the WEDF as one of the speakers. And, after many exchanges, we realized that we share a common passion and interest in using businesses as a force for good, and it aligns very well with our mission. It is really an honor and a pleasure to have you here to listen to your thinking around the theme of the circular economy. For us, it's important to see how we can make the connection to the work that we do in low-income developing countries, and in particular with small and medium enterprises. For those who have not yet read, these three gentlemen just published earlier this month in Harvard Business Review this piece called How Businesses Can Support a Circular Economy. They have done several other pieces for the World Economic Forum, for the European Union, which they work directly with Vice President Kaitainen on a special initiative in the EU for supporting the circular economy development in the European Union. So I think they're not only academics and thinkers, they're also practitioners who are looking at opportunities to implement these concepts in the real economy. I'll leave it at that. Hand it over to you. Do the brief presentation, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, and which will hopefully also take questions from the audience as well. Thank you again, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
How are we going to do it? Well, all right.
Sure.
Hey.
That's
Okay. Right. Good morning, everyone. First, thank you very much for having us being here today to talk about circular economy. Marcos has been very, very kind to us when it comes to describing us. I don't even know that we have achieved that much, but thank you very much for putting the sugar on the top. I guess what we're going to do today is it's actually rather simple, because I learned it from our students that no one really likes to listen to presentations for very long. So what we're going to do is to simply give a very, very quick overview as to what the circular economy is about. Now, as you can imagine, the context here is mostly about developed countries, simply because this is something that is the focus so far. We can tell you that either through the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the WEF, and the EU, they're mostly focusing on the developing countries. For the first time, as I always say, the US is behind us. So EU is now really at the forefront, if things actually turn out quite all right, at the forefront of this concept. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly go through the circular economy concept, and then after that, we can actually open up the discussions to everyone, especially when it comes to how to really put things into practice in both low-income countries, the developing countries, and two, at the SMEs level. Mark, you have anything to add?
Maybe just as an intro chat so that we can introduce the topic from our own perspective. So we came across the circular economy in the summer. We were approached by Vice President Kaitainen to take part of our resources and dedicate them to what Kaitainen was trying to put together in the circular economy package that was launched in the European Commission in December. So none of us came from the circular economy per se. We were coming from finance, economics, competitiveness. These were our gardens. And then suddenly we got ourselves thrown into this conversation. So at first we were a little bit skeptical. It looked like a buzzword. It made us think about environmental policy. We were a little bit concerned that it was kind of the same old story, now packaged, glorified version, yes, of recycling. And I've been telling this to a number of people. that I presented the concept, I always found the name circular economy doesn't necessarily depict really what we're talking about, mainly because it has this sense of balance, a circle, but there is less of an understanding of growth from there. It looks like minimizing the impact more than generating opportunities. And then as we were actually starting to go deeper into this conversation, we realized that the story was much deeper to our own understanding of economics. We find the circular economy to be probably the most promising paradigm emerging from the conversation that we had in a number of years. This is not a new conversation we're having. I think we're proposing this in a new way, in a sense that the awareness, the way in which we're arranging the debate, the degree of expertise that we are rising from different fields is now converging. I think in the past, circular economy was really more about, could be supply chain, or it can be maybe like a glorified version, as Terence said, of environmental policy, or it was about just trying to deal with waste. We find the story is much deeper than this. So we don't want to spend too much time in just going through a presentation. We want to tell you what we have, where we started from, and then from there take you to where we think there is the greatest opportunity, mainly for practitioners like you, who are working directly in low-income economies. We do think, just to fast forward a little bit on this, that the greater opportunity for this to become real doesn't come from the rich countries. The rich countries don't have the capacity to engage in a true systematic understanding of the circular economy, not in any fundamental way. They have a way to redeem their policy to something more inclusive, and they will probably do this out of necessity. But the emerging economies where we really see this as a differentiating factor, or where we can imagine their growth to be radically different from the way we grew. And that radical difference is not less of a growth. We think it's just a better growth, and probably a growth that is also historically relevant. And that's where we think this conversation, that's where we'd like this conversation to go today. Maybe as a final intro chat, I'll pass it to Khaled, and then we can show you some slides. But it's really instrumental for the conversation rather than illustrating anything in particular.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much again for the introduction. I think a very important aspect of what we're doing right now is to ask a very simple question, and that is, where are we going to get economic growth in the future? If we look at the period between 1994 and 2007, the world economy experienced an unprecedented and uninterrupted growth in economic activities. And this unprecedented and uninterrupted growth for a period of 13 years literally were due to many factors. And the factors probably could be to some geopolitical changes, to China, it could be to the World Wide Web. During that period of time between 1994 and 2007, probably there's all the technological advancements, there are the issues relating to financial deregulation and easy credit. So for that period of time, the world just grew. And the growth literally impacted both the developed as well as many of the developing countries. Now the question between 2007 and now, literally we've had a period of not knowing whether the economy is actually growing or not. At best, some major economies will be growing at about 2%. Probably the US, in Germany, probably about 1%. So as academics and practitioners, the search for ideas to identify what are the factors that's going to really propel growth in the world economy is paramount. Now we've come to the point where you say, well, will we have the same factors that led to the economic growth between 1994 and 2007? Probably the answer is no. Now, so is there some kind of a model that will achieve that growth? Can there be a model that will achieve that growth? Will there be some kind of an economic partnership between the developed as well as the developing countries? I mean, potentially there is, and a common denominator is a circular economy. Now, we can discuss this a little bit more, and we will see why, at least in our opinion, why the circular economy is a vibrant potential model that if we identify the key issues relating to it, and all the stakeholders and players, decision makers, governments, businesses, large and small in developed and developing countries, we can potentially have a very important step forward. Now, the question that always will be with us is that we we have finite resources? Can we achieve infinite economic growth? And the answer is no. So the question is that how do we move forward with the finite resources, hence the circular economy? So this is my little intro to this, but we'll be discussing this further.
We'd like to show you is how we came across this. So this is not really interesting in the sense of what we would like you to go with this conversation, but it shows you how we got to engage into this conversation. So this is something we always use when we are presenting circular economy relative to the concept of Europe, where we are somehow hosted in this moment. And then from there, we started to really understand the principal problem around the linear model, which is around waste. When we talk about waste, there are two ways of thinking about waste. One is really thinking about the end of the line, which imagine that no matter what the process implies, there will be a moment in which that process is culminating to the end process. It could be really waste in the more semantic sense of the term. But there's also a degree of waste which is generated by the process constantly creating value. So if creating value is what the purpose of firms, for example, is, no matter whether it's a private sector, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a government, with the access with funds and so on and so forth, the access to markets, as the value is created, we also increasingly generate waste. Most of the waste we create is not visible. It's not just the waste we imagine to be the waste that we have to get rid of. That's easy. Not easy, but it's easy to visualize. What we're interested in is the degree of wastefulness that we incur as we try to create growth. So there is no economic evidence that shows that growth has to happen as a trade-off between a plus and a minus. And that's come from industrial economics. In the 20s, we thought about that because we had abundance of resources. It's the only way we actually could imagine what was the translation between input and output. But as we continue to move forward with the analysis, we notice that there's a lot of waste that is actually intrinsic. So the first question we really have is, can we get awareness about this waste? If we do have awareness about this waste, can we measure it? Can we monetize it? Can we have a sense of impact that the waste generates in the value chain? And that's where we'd like this conversation to start. So we're going to run through very simple numbers relative to the EU 28. I think EU 27, 28, I don't remember whether the report was already including the 28th member state. But it really gives you a sense about what the rich world generates in terms of waste. So do you want to?
Yeah. Okay. So here are a couple of questions. Write it down, the answers, and then we are going to share the answers found in the studies. So, first question is the amount of food wasted in the value chain in Europe, or percentage. So write down whatever you think that the case would be. I'll write it down. Just write it down. Number 2. The fruits and vegetables of their edible mass is lost. Number 3, the original value of steel is lost after the first use recycle. Number 4, the original value of PET and cardboard papers is lost after the first use recycle. Number 5, cars that are parked or not used on an average day. Last questions. Office not used during work hours.
Like now?
Like this special occasion right now. Special occasion. There are lots of special occasions in Europe, right? Like. Okay, so, so here are the answers just for fun. So not for but hopefully it will be also telling. One, the food wasted is about 30%. It's lost in the value chain. As it turned out, the biggest waster in the whole chain actually is the end user, which basically put a lot of food away in the end. Fruits and vegetables. Lost along the way, about half of it. A lot of the time, it's because they look ugly, and probably even if they look in the most, like a pristine form, if you only see one lettuce on the shelf, chances are like lots of people won't buy it. So number 3, the how much like value is lost, about 30% for steel. Number 4, cardboard, about 60–70%. One thing that it does tell us here is that the traditional recycling, it's a good idea, but is it really as beneficial as many people would think? Cars not parked or used, about 92% of the time. Yep. What is happening to your cars right now? I guess. Okay. Office not used during work hours, 60%. Yeah. So, okay. So, right. So the, what is it?
Yeah, we can stay maybe on this.
Yeah, we'll say these numbers now.
Okay. So we do this game just to show you that this is happening in rarely conscious markets. I mean, never like in the last 25 years, the conversation on the responsible consumer, responsible production, responsible ethical sourcing. We have never had that same degree of exposure to the overall impact in the value chain than actually we have right now. So the consumer today is much more proactive in making a choice that will have an impact in the lifespan of a product than what we can imagine in the past. And still, in a relatively responsible society, and relatively means what it means, right? We have a relatively high number of wastefulness that is produced. The question is this intentional? So our assumption is to start from the fact that it's not intentional, otherwise we will look at conspiracy theory. But we think it's not intentional because it's the way we are inherited the process of production that is creating this almost like these outliers of waste. So the question is, if we could do these exercises in the environment in which you operate. I know you guys operate in complex realities. You operate in an environment in which you might have issue with quality, standards, compliance. So Marcos have briefed us a lot about the nature of the work that keeps you busy, right? But the exercise is not immune from being done where you work. Can you imagine in a mapping exercise to determine in any degree of economic output, be this simple or sophisticated, what is the intrinsic impact of waste? And if you could generate understanding about this, so it's really more about the diagnostic and detection of this, then would our story about the use of resources be any different? We think it actually would be. When we came across these numbers, our reaction was, wow, I cannot believe that trying to be a responsible consumer still, this is inbuilt in the way in which the paradigm is generating the waste. So this is where we like maybe this conversation to take you now, maybe in the moderated part with Marcos, to make sure that you are somehow directing also the conversation. But this is where we like you to start thinking at the value chain level, at the wastefulness, at the intrinsic dimension of wastefulness that is not necessarily planned, maybe in the design part of the plant obsolescence, and so on and so forth. So this is where we like maybe this conversation to inspire you as you are raising your question.
Terence and Khaled. No, this is a great first step in understanding where the opportunities are. From your research, if you can, I want to take it to the next practical level now in terms of the examples that you might have come across. Some of the case studies that we can start to think about what business models represent this paradigm shift into the so-called circular economy model. Maybe if you can elaborate a bit of the different business models you have observed through some of the cases that you have started to look at.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that we identified as we somehow looked at in the article that we published in HBR, and these are the models more again based on the developed countries. Companies. The first one, of course, is basically waste reduction. As you can see in the picture, there's something called inglorious fruits and vegetables. What happened is that we saw earlier on that a lot of food is being wasted simply because they just look ugly, and people do not want to buy fruits, and or actually not ugly, they just look odd. So people are not willing to buy these types of fruits. So what happened was that Intermarché, the French supermarket chain, as you all know, what they did is they basically turned it into ratatouille, shakes, juice, and soup, and then basically repackage it so that they can actually sell it out. As it turned out, like I just learned from Mark, basically there is a huge demand for it, and the supply is not even close to the what people are asking for. So it does like it may sound anecdotal to you, but to me it's a very, very important step. That's because one of the greatest challenges, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, it's basically getting the consumers to actually understand why there's the need for them to actually do their part when it comes to not wasting as much. Television, for instance, what happened is that television, 60% of the flat screen TVs in Germany was actually replaced, was still actually working. The reason is simple. Why people want to have a new television set is because they want bigger, like a bigger TV or screen sizes, better screen sizes. So it almost sounds like consumers associate having a lot as, you know, like as a lifestyle, and I think that there is a need to change it. So reducing waste, that's that's one of the key. Another key here is basically having the need to distinguish between two types of recycling. First, there is closed loop recycling, and there's open loop recycling. I think one of the problems we have today is when we look at recycling, we almost like believe that everything that is being recycled, it's we can actually reuse it. The fact is that a lot of the stuff, especially plastic, every time you recycle it, it actually loses a lot of intrinsic value. Which means that a bottle of water, the bottled, once you recycle it, you cannot use it for the bottle again. And when we were looking at the research, one thing that we found was this: basically, the bottled, when it comes to recycling those bottles, we were asking who was actually paying for it. Now, if I were to throw that question to you, who do you think actually pays for the recycling of the bottled that comes with the bottled water? You probably would think one is the government paying for it. No, that's not true, as it turned out. Two, it's the drink companies, right? No, that's not true. Sorry? The consumer. No, that's not true neither. I'm terribly sorry. As it turned out, the one who is actually paying for it are the actual bottled producers. And the reason is very simple, because if they can actually get you to recycle it, it will reduce our conscience of using bottled water. Now, I couldn't believe it. I have to say, I said, whoa, this is a bit far-fetched, and probably that is probably should be in the next episode of X-File. But having said that, when we were doing it, when we were talking about to a bunch of Finns on this subject, one of them actually came up and said, "Yep, it's actually true, because in Finland, at the very least, it is actually the bottling company that is actually paying for the recycling." So to us, there are, I think, a lot of things that consumers would have to play a very crucial role. I'm talking too long, right? For too long. Okay. Let me actually quicken say a few more words. Another thing that we're seeing is something called a performance model, or better known as servitization. It's very simple. What it's saying is that as opposed to selling a product, what you could sell right now is a service. The one that I like the most is actually a company called Mud Jeans, which is basically right behind me, the logo. It's a Dutch company. What they do is simple. They don't sell you a pair of jeans, and you don't buy. You can if you want to, but you don't have to buy a pair of jeans. What you do is basically you rent a pair of jeans from them. Okay, so you may be asking, why would anyone want to rent a pair of jeans? Simple. From the consumer's perspective, when you're done with a pair of jeans, or you find it too old, or out of fashion, whatever, you can actually return the pair of jeans to them. From the company's perspective, exactly because you don't own the cotton, you own the right to use the pair of jeans, but because you don't own the cotton, what it means is that when it comes to disposing the pair of jeans, you will have to actually bring it back to them. So in what they do then with the used pair of jeans is they would actually either turn it into vintage, or they would actually grind it down and mix it with new cotton so that they can come up with new pair of jeans. All right. So what you're seeing here is something that is probably not terribly innovative, but sufficiently innovative in a sense that to create like a sense of like not getting the consumers to waste or simply just throw things out, because a lot of the time when we throw things out, they will all end up ending in landfill. This company, as you can see from the producer's perspective, you are basically taking back your own cotton, which means that you are going to make sure that you are using the right cotton, because if you use cheap quality cottons, it's very, very difficult to recycle later on. And what we're seeing here is that lots of companies are already turning instead of selling stuff to customers, they are basically renting things to them. Okay, Reich Office is another one. What they do is simple. When they sell furniture, they don't necessarily sell furniture. They sell a service that allows the companies to actually if they ever want it to be refurbished or remodularize it, if you want, the customers can actually do that. We don't need to actually talk about this because Uber, BlaBlaCar, and Airbnb is very common. What it's saying is this. What we found out is that recycling, as good as it sounds, but if you were to recycle an iPhone, for instance, what you will find is that the recycled parts would only retain about 0.25% of the original value. On the other hand, if you were to sell the actual phone in the second-hand market, you can probably retain half of it. What it's telling us is something simple. Recycling is not the only way to go forward. What we can also do is to create a lot of second-hand markets, which in some ways is it's difficult maybe for a lot of consumers, because having second-hand stuff doesn't fit my stylish lifestyle. But then on the other hand, probably it will be it is something that is better for the economy. Very quickly, last one, remanufacturing. This Renault, for instance, what they do is they would actually take back a lot of the gearboxes, engines, engine parts, transmissions. What they would do is they will basically refurbish them to near new conditions, and as a result, it basically it makes things a lot cheaper for the customers, because it uses up less resources. That's one. And two, the fact that you are taking a lot of the existing products back and refurbishing it, you are effectively preventing the use of the resources in the first place, which is a very, very critical component in the conversation of circular economy. So along the way, they save a lot of energy and water. I think one thing that I should actually mention when Mark was talking about a lot of waste that we don't see. We see a lot of waste. If we go to look at pictures of landfills, we know that we're wasting a lot. If we look at our green bins, we can see that we're wasting a lot. But there is a lot more things that are lost along the way. For instance, if we were to go back to the original question, how much of the value of steel is actually lost after first recycling? Probably 30%. And I would think, okay, 30%, is it good, bad? I don't know, but it is probably not too bad. But what happened is that a lot, when the steel was being produced, we need to use about 10,000 liters, I think, of water in order to produce I can't remember the unit of steels. What's the rate of use of hidden water on a pair of jeans? Do you remember?
8,000 liters.
So 8,000 liters, right?
Yeah, so one pair of jeans is 8,000 liters to produce. So that's because we never worry about water in the first place. So why should we worry if it takes so long? But it clearly has become an issue if water becomes scarce, which is what we notice in some region where water is somehow shaping geographies as well, and geopolitical geography in that sense. If I can mainly move on so that we all tend to give you a little bit of where we think the opportunity is. Some of these examples are good. We're not necessarily too interested about this example. They are great for our research. They're great to animate the Harvard Business Review article, which has a relatively privileged readership. We don't think it's really where the story is. We think the story is somewhere else, is in peripheral to what we actually finding out. We know that some of these examples are great, but Matt Jeans is one boutique in Amsterdam. If they don't scale, no matter how good their model is, then it will just become a case study, but nothing more. So the question we're really raising is, how do we systemize this? How do we make sure this is becoming a conglomerate? How do we make sure this is becoming normal practice for anybody, regardless of their own bottom line, to initiate? And we think that the rich economy does not have the capacity to make it happen so quickly. There are too many barriers that are somehow historical. We have inherited a lot of the industrial model and the way we think. So unwiring this will take generations of people that will rise with an entirely different way of looking at resources. But the remaining part of the economy, where most of the people are concentrated, what used to be called the rest of the world in many ways, has the ability to operate out of scarcity as part of their paradigm, not because they wanted to, but because this is the only way they had to deal with. They don't have the same degree of sophistication of the infrastructural work, so they don't have grids of power, energy, to the same point in which you have to replace the old for the new one. In many cases, they can go from nothing to digitalization in no time. So we think that the emerging economy is where we should really focus a lot of the effort, because the way they'll generate the integration of the different component of the economy is what we can use also to inspire, let's say, sub-emerging economy or economy that are not doing so well. As we talk about this in every possible way, Khaled maybe can share with you, from the consumer perspective, what is this potential supply chain that might start from the consumer, which is another element that might close the loop from the different things we have seen, not only industrial, but also in terms of the value chain.
We try to simplify the traditional linear model in economics. In very simple terms, we are talking about take, make, and use. So in other words, if we look at, that's very linear. So it's a take, make, use, and then what happens afterwards. That's what we're studying. Now, if you look specifically at this, if we try to bend the model a little bit, so not have it in a linear way, and if we look at the details of what goes into taking, what goes into making, and what goes into using, and then we see that there is some kind of a gap that has not been filled. And potentially that unfilled gap could be potentially a source of economic growth, which we are overlooking. And if we look at the whole process of actually producing anything and using anything, it literally starts from, I would say, some kind of a design, prototype. Then from the design part, you go to resource acquisition. After resource acquisition, you have the manufacturing or the servitization, whatever the case might be. And that manufacturing then is sent to the retailer and then the wholesaler. And then after the retailer and the wholesaler, it goes to the consumer. It stops there. Now, there is a gap between the consumer and the original design. Now, this gap, at least in my view, is a potential source for economic growth. And it's a big gap. Now, one of the things that we would like, so we can see the source of the supply chain. Design, resource acquisition, manufacturing, then going to the retail wholesale or wholesale retail, and then going to the consumer. Now, so this is a supply chain. What we are proposing is to create a supply chain which starts with the consumer. Now, the question is that how do we start a supply chain that literally where the beginning is a consumer? And that is where, theoretically, the consumer will play a very important part in being a great participant and contributor to economic growth and also to closing the loop. Now, we have some ideas, basically, on how you can get the consumer to start the supply chain. I mean, of course, you need to talk about incentives. Incentives are always there. How can you incentivize every single part of this circular structure? How can you incentivize every one of them to contribute to some kind of a closed-loop circular economy? So our view is basically about starting a new supply chain, and the beginning is a consumer.
So we were talking about resource scarcity, and this is very much the case, even more so for smaller businesses, right? The work that we do puts, small and medium enterprises at the front and center of all our effort. I wanted to hear where you see opportunities deriving from this type of model, from this type of thinking, where SMEs could benefit from, and specifically in resource-constrained environments. I mean, we've had a discussion about the work on frugal innovation, a lot of interesting experiences coming out of India, for example. But where do you see the role of SMEs in the context of this conversation?
I mean, of course, we all know that micro, nano, micro, small, medium-sized enterprises in the developed world literally account to about 99.9% of the number of companies. Their contribution in the developed world is about probably 60% to job creation and about 50%, just a little bit less than that, to GDP. Now, what we're seeing is that given the economic shocks that we've had, and we can always refer back to the financial crisis, we can see that what's happening is that a lot of companies, I'm not saying that to all companies, but a lot of companies have been restructuring, right-sizing, outsourcing, downsizing, whatever the case might be. Now, hopefully with the aim of reducing costs and achieving growth. Now, if we assume that these companies are not going to achieve the kind of growth that they achieved before, the question is that where will the growth come from? In my view, and definitely in our view, what we've been discussing is that it's inevitable. Small, medium-sized enterprises will be sources of growth. Now, the question is that we've seen that. Unlike, entrepreneurship, basically innovation, small, medium-sized enterprises are basically the natural innovators, regardless of whether they are in the developed world or the developing world, they're natural innovators. So their role is pivotal, therefore their role is important. The question is that how do you systemize this growth and development? Now, of course, they suffer from finance gaps, they suffer from credit rationing, and they have a whole range of different problems. Now, the way we see things is that, yes, I think this, especially when we focus on this circular economy model, it is very, very critical to identify the potential partnership that exists between small, medium-sized enterprises, organizations like yours, the government, even large companies, potential joint ventures, potential, basically, large companies creating incubators, accelerators, basically for small, medium-sized enterprises. We live in a one-world system, and and that world has become a small village with the internet. So we need to literally have large companies, successful companies, rich organizations, rich governments, and so on, also team up with small, medium-sized enterprises in the developing world. And this potentially can happen. So their role, in fact, that is where I think things should start, in my opinion, anyway.
So Marcus, briefly on your same question, we think that the concept of scarcity is a perspective, especially if you're insular to your own environment. If you think about a small company operating in an environment, then of course it's going to always be measured by how much you do or do not have. This is somehow, again, this is mainly because of the intrinsic way in which we currently measure value. But if at the territorial level we raise, and I think a lot of the work you do is to go there and facilitate communication, debates, you're generating bridges. There's a whole series of work that you probably do in making sure that you're generating liaison between players. If that conversation becomes collaborative and systemic in nature, what simply becomes is that the sense of resource scarcity becomes shared to the point in which maybe there is mutualization in the way resources are currently being utilized. In our previous meeting, you talked about shared resources being a common practice in what you do. The question, if it's shared resources is not following a specific model, it only becomes a process to decrease what it could be, for example, an accounting statement. It doesn't become driver of, for example, innovation. So we find it's really, scarcity is an issue, but is not determinant to what is actually the possibility for growth that can emerge from this economy. When we having several large multinational working in a deprived area, we always have this impression that the only one having scarcity are the small, medium enterprise and not the multinational firms. So it's really more how we are trading the conversation in a way in which is becoming more of an environment in which we operate in, the whole idea about the ecosystem, rather than having this insular reality that makes them compete sometimes between each other. We find that their degree of innovation tends to be higher by Russia, considering the degree of resources they have. The question is whether we can leverage on this even more. Can we help them move into mainly global markets? Can we raise what you guys know very well as their competitiveness proposition? And we think this is possible, but mainly in also identifying on the territorial level what are the opportunities already in place, but never explicitly defined as such. I would imagine if we're not so good in the rich world to define collaboration because we have no view of the peripheral approach, the same could be true in emerging economy where we have less sophistication. So can we visualize the territory in a different way? That would be my answer. I don't think scarcity is a determinant that is actually independent. I think scarcity is how we measure it if we are having a specific way of transitioning input versus output. But if we map visually resources on the territory, we might discover an entirely different flow of information that we don't really know. One example, and I'll pass it on to Terence. During the microcredit evolution, when we had the Grand Bank, the Gankiva, going in areas in which there was no access to finance in the traditional sense, we discovered that repayment rates were higher than in the rich world. How were they making this possible? They were tapping on the collaborative spirit of the community that was somehow operating as a whole rather than individual parts. The emerging economy is much more keen on understanding the role of collaboration because for them it's been almost like a condition of life. I think if we don't make this only a lottery of birth, but we also make it as a potential economic proposition, we can truly shape different type of debates, conversation, opportunity. So for me, it's not really a matter of resources per se, it's a matter of the conversation that we had about resources for the last decades.
Answering that question. Basically, I think like SMEs, there are two ways to capitalize on the concept of circular economy. One is to basically, turn the waste that they have generated into opportunities. And the second one is redesigning the value chain. Now, as you can imagine, the second item would be a lot more difficult, whereas the first one would be a bit easier because all you need to do is to identify the waste. Now, the question here is, how to go about doing it. One company that is called Design, that is based in Estonia. Now, what it does is this. This company is a startup. It's an SME over there. What they did is actually they bought all these textile that are actually, textile that are wasted in process. So basically all the ends and everything. If you like a thing about textile, there are three types of textiles, like the pre-consumer, the pre-consumer, the process, and the post-consumer. We have been talking about post-consumer, but they are very difficult to collect, so mud jeans would work with that. Pre-consumer, a lot of the time, so if you are looking at simply just rubbish, if you're simply looking at fabrics that are like not used, not processed, a lot of the time the quality is really not up to the standard. So the best type of quality in terms of textile are all those textiles that are being cut and used already, and the leftovers. So what this Design did was basically they bought a lot of these processed cloth, if you like, or waste process, like a during process. They bought it from Bangladesh. What is interesting in this case is that it is not the Estonian government paying for the paying the SMEs to do it. It's actually the Bangladeshi government who is supporting the companies financially. And the reason is simple, because this is one way for the Bangladeshi factories to actually get rid of the waste. So the idea here is that can we actually find waste that are actually usable for the Western world? So that's the first thing, and I believe there are a lot of it. It's just like because we have not systematized it, we have not basically been able to visualize it. Therefore, we don't know anything about it. And I think ITC, if there's one thing that the ITC could actually play a crucial role, and that will be in first, identifying the waste to opportunities, or some people even call it waste to wealth. The second one, it's redesigning the value chain, which I think is a lot harder. to be honest, because like if you think about the simplifying the waste to opportunities, the SMEs themselves can do it themselves. But redesigning the value chain, that would involve a lot more government support. ITC will have to come in, probably like what Khaled was saying earlier on, maybe like even Mark was saying, like a combination of large and small companies working together. So I think like resource scarcity, actually, as it turned out, it's an opportunity presenting for the SMEs. The question is, can we actually go and find out where they are? And I believe that there is a lot of them.
I'll now make the link with a little bit closer to the work that we do as ITC and more broadly of development partners such as us, development institutions. We of course look at development from the private sector's perspective and use that as the thrust for our work. But we also have here in the room some of our development partners interested in how we can translate those concepts and those ideas into action through our work. You mentioned some of the collective action type dynamics. You started talking a little bit about some of the opportunities, but I wanted to hear two things. One is going back to the initial concept of competitiveness, right? And this is, I think, our common thread. You all are practitioners in the field of competitiveness. Can you explain a little bit more the link between the circular economy concepts and how it relates to competitiveness, right? And then the second part of the question is, then what does that mean for us as ITC, and how do we take that? What opportunities do you see for an institution such as ITC and others to engage and to leverage this for our mission and objective as an institution?
Can I start very quickly, because I talk a lot. So I will answer the first question. So I'll make sure that you have something to you get your time. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So the question here is how to increase the competitiveness. I'll go back to the 2 points, the waste to opportunities and the redesigning the value chain. I think the first thing is simple in terms of competitiveness. It's basically finding, if you manage to turn all these cloths and sell it abroad, effectively, you are basically pulling money out of thin air. I mean, not thin air, but the idea is that it is you have to pay to get rid of it anyway. You might as well turn it into money. So in that sense, it's already raising the amount of money that SMEs are have made, and therefore the whole idea after that is that logically they would be able to translate into better wages, or there are more money they're doing better, and therefore the prosperity of the economy would go up. The second point, redesigning the value chain, I guess that is where really the main thrust is in terms of raising the standard of living for any economies, and that is by having big companies and small companies working together. They can really come up with something innovative, and as a result, I believe that that would increase the productivity of the SMEs in these low developing countries, and that in general would help them with the education, with job creations, with upgrading their capabilities. So I guess at a very superficial level, that we can see that competitiveness can actually be raised based on working with the SMEs.
So Marcus, on your question, so the school of thoughts many of us come from in competitiveness implies that you're intensifying factory production, so that you're going to go from resources to manufacturing, services, and innovation, and it's a process in which you're going from intense to disintensified as you model your economy to innovative one. That's a great story if we had the assumption of abundance as an independent variable. The problem that we have is that on a global level, we are decreasing competitiveness because the access to resources is not as easy as before. So I would say that if we don't do it anyway, there is no chance we can ever raise competitiveness in the first place. So for me, it's becoming almost a sense of competitive necessity that we cannot really run away from. The other thing is that what really shapes the current economy on the global level is the fact that you notice that there is a lot of volatility. Volatility comes from the fact because the resources are no longer accessible as they used to be before, so they have become commodified in many ways. By having control in the circular process, let's say that you have in Russia control by 10, 15, 20, 25% of your value chain is controlled in terms that you can circulate some of the resources somehow. You decrease the dependency on markets for the price of commodity to be inferred upon you. So even in that sense, I don't think that is a one-by-one way of saying this is the old way of doing competitiveness, this is the new way. It's everybody going to be impacted by the fact that resources will become scarce as we continue to increase urbanization. So I think it's really how we're raising the urgency in the clients that you are working with in understanding that the old model of competitiveness used to work really well in countries where abundance of factory production was a given. I'm going to give you a fun fact about this. In 2014, I was at the World Economic Forum, and in my meeting, there was the president of Estonia. And he knew that I was affiliated with the School of Thought of Professor Porter at Harvard Business School. The first thing he said to me, when you see Professor Porter, can you tell him the cluster theory did not work in Estonia? This was 2014. And I said, why don't you tell him, President Ilves, because otherwise I lose the very few moments of friendship with Porter. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe the way we can bring it at the ITC level, ITC become an advocate of a different narrative on competitiveness that can no longer follow the industrial economics in which the assumption the world was in abundance. What will be the model of increasing standard of living when we have scarcity of resource in the first place? And I think this is where you guys have access to that type of debate, mainly because of the nature of your mission. So I would answer by really saying building some degree of ratio in the value chain where you can visualize the circularity. No matter whether it's a 5%, 10%, 15%, you can basically convert it back into how much of the volatility is being decreased in the way you're currently generating your value.
Thank you, Mark. I think when we talk about competitiveness, the important thing is to ask a very simple question, and that is, what are the enablers of competitiveness? So where does competitiveness come from? Once we've identified where competitiveness comes from, then we can zero in on these and develop basically towards that goal. I mean, what are the sources of competitiveness? I mean, in my opinion, innovation, efficiency, productivity, learning curves, building industry expertise, cost management and control. So if you put all of these things together and add to it potential joint ventures in the supply chain, forward as well as backwards, that will also contribute to competitiveness. So I think from the ITC's perspective, to focus on these elements, I think will hopefully enhance the whole process of it. So going back to innovation, efficiency, productivity, learning curves, building capacity and building basically industry expertise. I mean, that learning curve with industry expertise allows you to manage and control costs. And if you are managing and controlling costs, you are competitive by nature. End of the story. We're not only driven by revenue. I mean, we're not talking about basically German manufactured product, which are high quality, and then consumers are willing to pay the higher price for that. And they can compete on the basis of quality. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, others should not, but I think it is about building industry expertise.
Thank you very much. I suggest that we now open up to the audience, and we have about a half an hour. Now we've covered a good ground in this first almost 1 hour of discussion. And I think it will be very helpful now to engage a little bit with the audience and have a more interactive discussion. So I'll just open up for questions, and we'll have about 30 minutes to engage in this discussion. Thank you. Yeah, I'll repeat the question so we capture on video. Thank you.
The question is that how can we transform the value chain from elite companies to the consumer. The important thing, and I answered that this is a challenge, but we are not saying it should be transformed. We're saying that it should be added to it. So in other words, the supply chain will still be there from the elite companies, and it's not going to be replaced. It should be complemented by the consumer. So it's a complementary process. And yes, I mean, there's no way that this system can be replaced. But how do we complement that? I think by creating incentives for the consumer. And just give this very simple example. How about if, say, for example, every household, let's say, I'm talking about European context for now, and then feels that, okay, well, they can add an extra 200 euros, for example, or pounds, or Swiss francs, whatever the case might be, to their income by every month, literally by identifying what they can dispose of. And then the question is that how do you, then if you have collectively consumers who buy into these incentives, then obviously the supply chain has to start. So then you probably will have small, medium-sized enterprises that will say, you know what, we will go by and we will collect these things. If it is not them, probably it's the post office. If it's not them, it's whatever, whoever has a direct linkage to the final consumer. Right, and we are thinking about these things, but please don't think that it is a replacement model. No, it's a complementary model.
So consciousness, I start from that one. The question was whether we have really acquired more consciousness or not. So Marion, I think we have much more lip service now than ever before. We have much more access to information than ever before. We have ethical sourcing, so there's a lot of people reading labels and figuring out whether they are produced somewhere or somewhere else. I'm not sure that means that we are a better society in any way. But what I'm trying to say is that the conversation has become very fatigued about the whole social responsibility that became an empty word for many different meanings in many ways. And so hopefully we're not going to have the emerging economy going through the same trap or going through, figuring out a blah, blah that leads to lip service but no content whatsoever. So the question that we're trying to raise before was the fact that while we're very, very conscious in a number of ways, we also very, very entrapped into the obsolescence of product because we're obsessed with consumption. Consumption is still the constituent of the GDP formula in the greatest portion of it. So if we don't consume, our economies do not grow. If they don't grow, central banks become very nervous. They start giving access to banks, and banks do not necessarily lend back forward on. So we have this vicious circle of deflation that has been common in many of the rich economies. So what I try to say is that our current model doesn't necessarily mean that we are immune from going through this process, but I find that it'll take us longer, which is a part that I said in a different comment, for us to really transform to a circular model, because all of these practices for me are still bound by the problem that we still need consumption as being positive for us to move our economy forward. I think the emerging economy don't have the same metrics. And so they don't necessarily measure the value of the economy in the same way. A lot of it is very informal, so it cannot be measured in the same way. A lot of it is actually really turning waste into opportunity because there is a much more mobile sense of the value chain. So I find there are opportunities that they have already been facing with this circularity in a way which is much more innate than what we think. I'm going to give you two examples. We were having this conference at INSEAD about entrepreneurship, and there were all white guys talking about it. And we discovered that in many sub-Saharan contexts, the concept of entrepreneurship is the way people live life by taking constant risk. So again, an example of how we think about categorical thinking in terms of entrepreneurship, but how there is a difference between what we think it is and what other economies think they are. The same principle can be applied, for example, with unemployment. In the rich world, we talk about unemployment. In some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the word unemployment does not exist in the local language. Why? The principle of not being employed seems to be alien. So I find that our model are somehow more rigid for a transformation because we really inherited a lot of linearity from the way we think.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, one of the things that I think it's important to literally bear in mind is that we should not think about the circular economy coming from the richer economy to the poorer economies. Probably there are a lot of low-income economies that are more circular than many of the richer economies. And because of the fact that you said, and I totally agree, I'm like what applied to your grandmother probably applied to my grandmother as well, because of this efficient allocation of the scarce resources, which is literally the foundation of the definition of economics. One of the things that we need to really emphasize on in the context of the ITC probably, or in the context of developing countries, is that you can pick up certain countries in the world, and because they don't have sufficient resources, probably they do create a circular economy, but this has not been systemized to the level that we are asking for. So I think there should be a cross-fertilization of economic thinking in this specific model between the developed as well as the developing economy, where we should also say that we would like to learn from you. How did you do things? Not only to lecture them and say what you've been doing is basically not consistent. But if they, I mean, all countries, if they feel that they're part of the process, then the incentive is there for contribution.
I just want to add one more comment to the consumer consciousness. Like I do realize that, you know, like I remember when I was a kid, you know, basically we don't throw things away. Now, you know, throwing things away, it's a very, very common practice. And I stopped, like I have to say, I started to fall into this trap as well, because like with all these new technological gadgets that comes out, I'm really find myself wanting to have some. I think like one thing that we haven't really talked about so far in terms of consumer consciousness is the problem with planned obsolescence. Basically, companies are actually deliberately making their goods less, less resilient. I was there. There was an article in the Guardian's newspaper like 2 weeks ago. They were saying that the title basically says why are we changing our cookers? My dear, it's only 60 years old. So. And the whole point of that article is asking, why are things that in the past it was made that can last so long. Now on average they last so much, the longevity is so short. So I think working on the producer side is always important. Going to doing your questions about waste opportunities. I don't think you really need to have the government to intervene. It's only in this case that odds design. It's just the Bangladeshi government is interested in it. A lot of the time, what you would find is that SMEs in developing worlds, they don't really need the governments to help them. Now, what it means is that these companies would have to find out the solutions themselves. So, for instance, there is a company called Husk Power in India. So what they did is this, basically they used the husk, basically shells of the rice. They would burn it down. So they would use it to generate electricity, heating locally. And then with the charcoals, they would actually sell it on to make fertilizers. So basically nothing, literally nothing get wasted along the, when the rice is produced. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning it is very simple, because all of these basically says that SMEs in developing countries, they do have the capabilities to come up with the ideas. The problem, of course, is that, how do they actually do it? Which go to my second question when you ask, well, the redesigning, a lot of big companies, they are already doing it. True, big companies developing, developed countries, they're all doing that. But when it comes to developing countries or even SMEs in developed world, it is a very, very rare thing. I had the absolute great fortune of speaking to a number of CEOs in London, because that's where I base, of companies in London. I was shocked, I have to say, to mention, every time I mention circular economy, they will be asking, what's that? I have never heard of it. So I guess, circular economy is not actually as well known as we like to believe, at the very least. I think another problem, of course, is going back to what Marcos has been telling us, is basically raising the awareness. I think green is a concept that everyone understands, but when it comes to circular economy, even the term, it's a bit, theoretical. So I think raising the awareness is one thing. That said, in order to get the SMEs, especially those in the developing countries, and I agreed like fully with what Khaled was saying earlier on. I think like developing countries have lots, like they're already doing lots of things that we in the developed countries would never have thought of, simply because of how everything is set up. For instance, the cost of disposal in England anyway, in the UK, is actually very cheap. You know, basically, there's no reason for us to actually think about using the rubbish because it's all going into the, you know, someone is paying for it. It's like, or that we pay for it through tax money, but it's very, very cheap. In like in the developing country settings, I think the challenges are very, very different. Exactly because they don't have the luxury to a lot of things. What it means is that they have to be a lot more innovative. And I think that this is where like you know, ITC or like any one of us should be doing when it comes to that part of the world is basically first increasing the awareness, and second, providing the assistance. I mean, even in SMEs in developed countries, they have no idea how to actually get around a lot of the problems. Finding the right staff apparently is a problem. Regulatory stuff is a problem, let alone financial, you know, incentive to to get over it.
Thank you for your question. So I'll start from the regulatory framework, if you allow me to. So I would say that in the most simplest form of economic activity, so the economy, they're still factor-driven, we don't see this being a particular big problem because many of these circular processes are just business practice, just a way of doing things better. So it's not necessarily something that will have an impact at the level, for example, of the government regulating a specific activity. And I think where we have an expression that Terence uses often, this low-hanging fruits, is really where can this become just the best practice of what you're currently doing. We know this, especially in Europe, that when the conversation on the circular economy was touching the assets, like, for example, the example of Uber, Airbnb, then governments start thinking about, is this legal? Have we thought about this in the first place? So we imagine that this could also be the case in the emerging economy when the conversation is actually maturing to that point. What would happen, for example, if a farming community has a tractor that will be basically leased to another one? Will that go through a regulatory framework? Will we have taxation? So I think as some of your clients are governments, one possibility is to engage them. How do we facilitate this hybrid business model to be incentivized rather than, for example, a business model that tends to be classic in many ways? On the risk management, I think we see this really as a way to control much more the concept of production at the internal level. It's important in any country, but more important in a country where you're not necessarily given access to all the resources you want, or you don't have the same access to procurement. So we find it a way also to position an organization inside of any given market context with some control on the price elasticity, because we think it can possibly help even smaller company to participate. But I'll let also Khaled and Terence tell you, but on the regulatory framework, it's really for me, probably not really every single contest will be a problem. So we have a lot of possibility already there that are dormant and they just need to be activated.
Thank you, Mark. I think with regard to regulations and in any economic model, I mean, like if we go back to the macroeconomic model, which is the consumer, the investor, the government, and then the international sector, and there's no question about that. The role of the government is extremely important. And I think that probably if it becomes, the circular economy becomes a norm, then probably some of the major organizations will need to comply. So there has to be also compliance, and compliance, there's a compliance cost that has to be taken into account. So I think, yes, the role of the government is important in every step of the way, because the government can create incentives as well. And that's could be a tax incentive or it could be a revenue incentive, whatever the case might be. Now, with regard to the risk management aspect, which you indicated, of course, I'm like, when it comes to risk management, it's a combination of two things. The probability of a negative event that will happen, and then the impact when this happens. Now, I mean, I think one way by which you can reduce a negative impact of an enterprise or a venture or an idea is to have some kind of a support and to have some kind of a partnership where the risk is spread. And I think the partnership, again, the role of the government, organizations, large companies, and so on and so forth will be there. It is a model. I think there's a very clever question, and I like that because it is a very important in there, because you need to incentivize these small, medium-sized enterprises. And the question is that, what is the revenue side, but there's also what's the risk side. And this has to be taken into account.
Going back to your questions, companies using other companies' stuff, I think that's the whole point. You know, you really need to basically not internalize the waste, you know, find like the ideal setting would be not even like the case of us design. Basically, you sell the cloth to the developed countries, Estonia being, you know, I'll count as developed countries. What you want to do is to actually sell it on to other SMEs within the economy or like, you know, nearby. So for instance, you know, like I'll give you two examples very quickly. One is Starbucks. You know, like big companies, you know, developed countries. What do they do in Japan is basically all these coffee left over at the end of the day of the branch. You have a lot of it. You have to find a way to dispose it. In Japan, what they did is they actually get some mushroom fertilizers to actually buy them and turn them into fertilizers that you can use for growing mushrooms. So, but that's the developed countries, you know, example. In the more developing world, a lot of the case, what we saw is that you can actually use what do you call it? I don't know how to actually put it elegantly. The gas coming out of animals, in order to actually like use it, turn it into biofuels, so some sorts, right? So and now, if you think about it, the biofuels, what you need is basically stoves, and then the stoves can be like made locally, and then like you have the whole chain set up. So I believe that it is absolutely doable. Going to Ben's question, I'm going to actually loop it with my key takeaways because it's a lot easier. I think like if there's one thing like I would like to do in order to push the circular economy concept forward, is basically by raising the awareness of just about everyone. It's key, because if they don't understand what it is all about, no matter what technical assistance, whatever like a type of education programs, I don't think it's gonna fly. It like everyone needs to understand somehow what it is. And I'm afraid, you know, at the moment the circular economy concept is a bit like undefined still, because there are so many people, so many players in this domain. So. If like raising the awareness is absolutely crucial. And second thing is basically try to visualize, you know, make it more visible as to where the waste opportunities are, because I think there's just a lot of it. It's just like people don't want to know, or it is simply not, like no one is researching on it.
Awareness, and then education, and then capacity building, and then impact. Now, with regard to the small, medium-sized enterprises, I'm always careful about using that term, because it's a very heterogeneous group. And when we talk about small, medium-sized enterprises, they're not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous. And they could be in different industries, different sectors, but also they are different stages of growth. You can have a small, medium-sized, you could be a startup, you could be a micro business that is surviving, you could be achieving growth, you could be developing, or you could be a mature small, medium-sized enterprise. And I think it's very, very important from our point of view is that when we want to link the circular economy to SMEs, it is very important to identify how this circular economy is going to help small businesses at these different stages. We can categorize these businesses in terms of them being startups or being surviving even. And like some companies that are surviving might find an opportunity in contributing to this circularity. Companies that are growing, they can achieve probably further growth. And that's what I think will be. So I'll be very careful, at least my opinion, to not literally put all of the small, medium-sized enterprises into one category, which I'm sure you all know.
So I might maybe use it as my takeaway and my closing comments, so that hopefully those two questions were somehow answered. What I like you to really consider is the economic opportunity that we have in creating jobs that have not been created yet. Not because we have to come up with very expensive new technologies, but because we only have to activate resources that are already deployed on the territory, but not necessarily integrated into productive process. So thinking about upgrading the economic infrastructure, I like to become ITC primary mission in understanding, rather than thinking about how do I get things better and following this sense of increasing or improving or helping them, is there any opportunity to activate those dormant demand and dormant supply that can only be addressed by having this conversation, raising awareness, education, and so on and so forth. I remind you, when the internet was not there, and I think some of you are lucky like us to remember when we didn't have the internet. And also I remind you what happened when the internet was introduced. This upgrade to this new economic infrastructure generated millions of jobs. So creation of job is not something that depends mainly on the mathematical model, how much I have and how much I will become. It's mainly about understanding how this can become processes that generate economy, society, fabrics, and so on and so forth. Where you can continue to study this, so it's not the best of the answer I'm going to give you. We don't find there is a lot of research on this. There is a lot of research coming from industrial economics, operation management, supply chain, but they tend to be somehow partial, or they tend to represent a partial understanding of the process. I think where we have an opportunity, and so this is more of a call for joint action than anything else, is can we create a more systematic, holistic framework of understanding where this can really become a conversation, a reality, a project, a grant, and can we start thinking about your side of the spectrum, our side of the spectrum, maybe joint publications. We found there is a lot of work coming from really prestigious entities like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the World Economic Forum, Accenture. But many of these entities, they really get inspired by practices coming from multinational firms. And it's actually fascinating to see how Philips innovates, but it's not useful in the sense that I cannot scale it or transfer it everywhere. We have the ambition to become a new pole of understanding of the circular economy. So Khaled has just started the Circular Economy Initiative at the University of Cambridge. We plan to make it a busy side of our time, and we want to sure that we're going to basically do what other institutions have never done. And so hopefully you guys can follow the nature of the work we do. Actually, I think maybe just because I'm in the middle, it's easy for me to say that. But we would like you to be part of this effort. We cannot do it just from the academic side, because unfortunately academics, they continue to be driven by other imperatives that tend to be on what they can be published, and what can be published cannot be experimental. And therefore, we need to have entrepreneurial activities, new type of research, action research, and hopefully you can help us in making this happen in some way. But that's where we think the opportunity really comes for learning a new language, and that has always been there, but not necessarily becoming the new convention, the new norm.
No, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. I think it's been, at least from my perspective, an extremely interesting discussion. It's great when we have the opportunity to step out of our daily grind and exercise some intellectual stimulation. For those who want to learn more, I'm sure the group here will be available. I'll be available myself. I particularly see this topic as a key future topic that we have to be attentive to as it relates to our work on enhancing competitiveness of companies and of the ecosystems where they operate. So with that, thank you so much again, and I'll offer you our round of applause, and thanks for your contributions.